After years of high-stakes work at the FBI, filled with stress, danger, and an ever-constant sense of urgency, I finally found the escape I'd been longing for. I had just moved into my dream home, a quiet, secluded house on the outskirts of town. It was far from the chaos of city life, a perfect retreat where I could finally breathe easy and enjoy the peace and solitude I had earned. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind where the grass always seemed a little greener, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine smiles. I intentionally chose a home outside the reach of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The very idea of being bound by arbitrary rules, sky-high fees, and an all-powerful board of self-appointed authorities was something I refused to subject myself to. But little did I know, this decision would set me on a collision course with the queen of the neighborhood, Karen Whitmore. Karen was the HOA president, and she took her role as the unchallenged ruler of the community far too seriously. From the moment I moved in, she made it her mission to get me to join her precious HOA. At first, it was subtle, a polite letter here and there, explaining the so-called benefits of joining the association. But when I politely declined, explaining that I preferred my privacy and independence, she didn't take no for an answer. I figured it would be no big deal. I could simply enjoy my home and stay out of the HOA's way. But Karen was relentless. I'd find her lurking near my mailbox, sending me emails about property values and community standards, insisting that the HOA was the key to a prosperous neighborhood. When that didn't work, she started showing up at my doorstep, trying to convince me in person. Each time, I maintained my firm, polite response. I wasn't interested. Yet, that seemed to enrage her even more. She told me, time and time again, that I was damaging the community, though my yard was well kept, and my home was always in excellent condition. The constant pressure, the nagging, the almost patronizing tone, it felt like she wasn't just trying to get me to join an organization. It felt personal. And I wasn't going to cave. Karen Whitmore didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a much bigger confrontation. The woman had underestimated me. What she didn't know was that, while I might have chosen a peaceful life, I had a history in law enforcement that ran much deeper than she could ever imagine. And that would prove to be her downfall. Karen, like most people who don't take no for an answer, didn't just give up. Instead, she escalated her efforts. I had been in enough high-stakes situations during my career in the FBI to recognize the signs of someone who wasn't willing to accept defeat. And Karen wasn't just persistent, she was vengeful. At first, it was small things, barely noticeable. My trash bins started going missing, and I'd find them days later, half a block away, as if they had been dragged around for no reason. Then it escalated to my mail going missing, something that felt more sinister than a simple mistake. It wasn't long before I started noticing the cancellations. Contractors I hired to work on my property would suddenly cancel at the last minute with no real explanation. Their excuse was always the same: something came up. But these weren't just small annoyances. These were calculated attacks designed to inconvenience me, to break me down, to get me to fold under pressure. And then came the fines. I had never agreed to any HOA rules, yet I started receiving violation notices for things like unapproved landscaping and unauthorized modifications. The problem was, none of those violations were even real. I wasn't part of the HOA, there were no rules I was breaking. Yet every other week, a new fine would arrive, each one more ridiculous than the last. The fines were clearly just a way to pressure me, to harass me into joining the HOA. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought that if I just kept my head down, the harassment would stop. But Karen had other plans. One day, she showed up on my doorstep, her face a mixture of determination and malice. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "You'll either join or you'll regret it," she said, a clear threat in her voice. I should have known then that this wasn't going to end well, but I stayed calm. I simply told her that I wasn't interested and closed the door behind her. I hadn't yet realized how far Karen would go to get what she wanted. I should have taken her words more seriously. It was a quiet night, the kind I had grown to love since moving into my new home. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. But that night, something was wrong. I woke up to a strange smell, a burning, acrid scent that I couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor's fire pit or perhaps something from the woods. But as I stepped out of bed, I realized it was coming from inside my house. My heart started to race, and panic gripped me as I rushed through the house. The smoke was thick now, the heat unbearable. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, but I knew it was too late. The fire had already taken hold of the living room. Flames licked the walls, crackling in the dark. I barely made it out alive, coughing and stumbling as I raced to safety. The fire trucks arrived minutes later, but by then, the damage was done. My dream home, everything I had worked so hard for, was gone. Reduced to nothing more than smoldering ruins. The police arrived shortly afterward, but it was clear this wasn't a simple accident. The fire had started in multiple places, no way that could be a coincidence. As they began their investigation, I felt a gnawing suspicion in my gut. This wasn't just some freak accident. I'd been harassed for weeks, and now my house was burned to the ground. But what shocked me more was Karen's reaction. At the next community meeting, she stood at the front of the room, an obnoxious smirk on her face. "Well, folks," she said, "we all know that the lot where Marcus Blackwell's house stood is now an eyesore. It's time we discussed plans for the property. We can't just have this abandoned lot in our neighborhood." It clicked. The fire wasn't an accident, it was a message. Karen had orchestrated it, and I was the target. She had done it to drive me out, to claim my property for herself and the HOA. I couldn't believe it. How far would this woman go to get what she wanted? She had no idea who she was dealing with. What Karen didn't know was that she had just poked the wrong bear. She might have thought I was just some average homeowner, but she couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't just Marcus Blackwell, a man who had spent years trying to escape the chaos of the FBI. I was Special Agent Marcus Blackwell, one of the highest-ranking directors in the state. I specialized in organized crime, fraud, and racketeering, and if there was one thing I knew, it was how to investigate. The moment I realized Karen's involvement in the fire, I knew what had to be done. I couldn't just let this go. I had resources at my disposal, contacts in high places, and years of experience in tracking down criminals. I wasn't going to let some power-hungry HOA president get away with arson. I reached out to some of my trusted contacts in law enforcement, and together, we launched a federal investigation into the HOA. We dug into their financial records, their operations, and their history. And what we found was staggering. Karen and her board had been running an elaborate scam for years, embezzling money, extorting homeowners, and even forcing people out of their homes to make way for new development. The HOA wasn't just a collection of neighborhood volunteers. It was a criminal organization. They were using their position to profit off the backs of hard-working homeowners, and they had no qualms about using illegal means to get what they wanted. From fake fines to shady land deals, the HOA was corrupt to its core. The final straw was the fire. Their attempt to destroy my home was a federal crime. With the evidence piling up, we were ready to strike. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I expected. FBI agents swarmed the neighborhood, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched Karen's empire crumble. I stood in the background, my arms crossed, as agents placed Karen and her entire HOA board in handcuffs. Karen's expression went from smug and confident to a look of pure disbelief. She had no idea what was coming. As they led her away, she screamed and yelled, claiming that this was all a conspiracy, that she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. But the evidence was overwhelming. Karen was charged with arson, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The fact that the fire had put lives in danger meant she was facing decades behind bars. She could no longer hide behind her position or her good intentions. The other members of the board were quick to turn on her. One by one, they started cutting deals with the prosecution, each of them eager to save themselves by throwing Karen under the bus. But I didn't care about them. I cared about one thing, justice. And justice was served. The HOA was dissolved, and the homeowners who had suffered under Karen's reign finally got what they deserved: compensation, a fresh start, and most importantly, freedom from her oppressive rule. Months had passed since the arrests, but the memory of that day was still vivid. The images of Karen Whitmore being hauled away in cuffs, her face twisted in a mix of disbelief and fury, were forever etched in my mind. The once self-assured HOA president, who thought she could rule with an iron fist, was now facing the harsh consequences of her actions. I had been keeping an eye on Karen's case, tracking her progress through the court system. The evidence was undeniable, and her days of freedom were numbered. The fire, the extortion, the racketeering, it all pointed back to her and her corrupt HOA board. She was looking at a sentence that could stretch into decades, and I had to admit, the thought of her being behind bars gave me a sense of satisfaction I had never expected to feel. It wasn't just about justice for me anymore. It was about giving back to a community that had suffered under her reign of terror. Those homeowners who had been forced into submission, who had lost their homes and their peace of mind, were now reclaiming their lives. And Karen? Well, she was about to learn what real consequences looked like. My visit to her wasn't something I'd planned to do right away, but there was a certain finality I needed to feel. As a federal agent, I'd seen it all: corruption, crime, deception, but nothing was quite as satisfying as seeing someone like Karen finally get what they deserve. I walked into the federal prison with purpose. The hallway was cold and sterile, the dull hum of fluorescent lights echoing in the otherwise silent space. I passed by a few guards who didn't give me a second glance. They were used to seeing agents come and go, but this visit was different. I wasn't here on official business. I was here for my own sense of closure. After a few minutes, I was led to a small, sterile room. Karen was sitting at the far end of the table, her head shaved, wearing the unmistakable orange jumpsuit. She was a far cry from the polished, entitled woman I had once encountered in the neighborhood. The woman who had arrogantly thrown her weight around, believing she was untouchable. Now, she looked smaller, her face a mask of bitterness. She didn't stand as I entered. Her eyes were narrowed, a sneer pulling at the corners of her mouth. I couldn't help but feel a little smug at the sight of her. She had thought she could escape the consequences of her actions, but now, here she was, trapped in the very system she had once believed she could manipulate. "So, Special Agent Blackwell," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" I took a seat across from her, my expression calm, controlled. The tables had turned in a way she never could have predicted. The power dynamic was no longer in her favor. She was no longer the one calling the shots, no longer the one who could intimidate and manipulate. I was in control now, and she had no power left. I leaned forward slightly, letting her words sink in before responding. "No, Karen. I don't think I've won," I said, my voice steady and firm. "I know I did." Her eyes flared with anger at my words, but she didn't respond immediately. For a moment, she just glared at me, as if trying to make me feel some kind of remorse, some kind of regret for what had happened. But there was nothing. I had no regrets. She had done this to herself. She had brought this all upon her. I sat back, folding my arms, and watched as Karen's frustration grew. Her face twisted in rage as she opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "The worst part about all of this, Karen," I continued, my voice cold, "is that you were so sure you were untouchable. You thought you could control people, ruin their lives, and get away with it. But in the end, you're just another criminal who thought they could outsmart the system." She slammed her fists on the table in anger, but I wasn't afraid of her anymore. The woman who had once tried to intimidate me was now powerless. I stood up, ready to leave, my work here done. "Enjoy your time here, Karen," I said, my voice dripping with finality. Because it's the last time you'll ever hold any power over anyone. As I turned and walked out of the room, I could feel her eyes boring into my back. But it didn't matter. She was just another criminal now, and I had one.